I didn't realize my cooking was a problem until my son Arthur told me it was too old-fashioned for his new lifestyle. The call came on a Tuesday morning exactly 10 days before Christmas. My hands were coated in flour, prepping the pie crusts I always froze in advance. I wiped my hands on my apron and tapped the speaker button on my phone. "Mom," Arthur began. He had that careful, measured tone he usually adopted when his wife Brenda was sitting right next to him. "Brenda and I were talking about Christmas dinner?" "Oh," I murmured, kneading the dough. "Yeah, we're actually going to do something different this year. We booked a table at Le Petit Chien. It's a modern fusion place." He paused, waiting for me to react. When I didn't, he rushed into the explanation. "Your cooking is fine, Mom. It really is. It's just a bit old-fashioned. Heavy. Brenda wants something lighter, more aesthetic for the holidays." I stared at the flour on my countertops. For 30 years, I had hosted Christmas. The turkey, the stuffing, the exact gravy recipe Arthur used to beg for. It wasn't just a meal. It was the anchor of our family. But there wasn't a trace of hesitation in his voice. "I see," I replied. "You can still come to the restaurant," he added quickly. "It'll just be easier. No cooking, no mess." "I understand, Arthur." "Great. Glad you're not upset. We'll finalize the time later." He hung up. I stood in the quiet kitchen. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the urge to call him back and argue. If they didn't want my food, I wasn't going to force it on them. I washed my hands, dried them on a towel, and looked at the massive turkey thawing in the lower drawer of my fridge. I had to decide what to do with 20 pounds of prime poultry, and I knew exactly where to start. I started packing up the pie crusts. They went straight into the freezer, though not for Arthur and Brenda. By noon, my kitchen was spotless. Nothing suggested a holiday was approaching. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Arthur. "Hey, Mom, the restaurant requires a deposit for large parties. Since you usually cover groceries for Christmas dinner, could you just transfer the deposit amount? It's $300. I read the message twice. Brenda's practicality at work. They didn't want my old-fashioned food, but my old-fashioned wallet was still perfectly acceptable. Instead of typing a long, emotional paragraph about respect, I opened my banking app. A few years ago, I had added Arthur as an authorized user on one of my credit cards for emergencies. It seemed he had grown accustomed to treating it as his personal holiday fund. I tapped the button to lock the card, then selected Remove Authorized User. It took less than 30 seconds. Then I replied to his text. "I won't be able to cover the restaurant deposit, Arthur. Enjoy your modern dinner." I tossed the phone onto the sofa. The house felt terribly quiet, but it was a clean, manageable silence. I wasn't going to sit around feeling like a discarded antique. If I was going to cook a massive holiday meal, I was going to cook it for people who actually wanted to be at my table. I grabbed my coat and a notepad. I had errands to run, but not the usual ones. As I stepped out onto my front porch, the crisp December air hit my face, clearing away the lingering sting of my son's words. I looked down the street, noticing the houses where the lights weren't quite as bright. My first stop wasn't the grocery store. It was the house 3 doors down, where a young man had just moved in alone. Julian was in his late 20s, a software developer who had moved from out of state. I only knew this because I had seen him struggling with a lawnmower in October, and I had walked over to show him how the choke valve worked. I knocked on his door. He answered wearing a faded hoodie, looking exhausted. "Marlene," he greeted, standing up a bit straighter. "Everything okay?" "Everything is fine, Julian. I just have a quick question. Do you have family in town for Christmas?" He rubbed the back of his neck, offering a tight smile. "No, ma'am. Flights back home were too expensive. It's just me and my laptop this year." "Not anymore," I told him. I'm hosting dinner on Christmas Day, traditional turkey stuffing pies. I'd like you to be there. Julian blinked, genuinely surprised. Are you sure I don't want to intrude on your family time? My family has other plans. The table is open and I cook entirely too much. 1 o'clock. Don't be late. I didn't wait for him to overthink it. I turned and walked back down his driveway. One seat filled. I needed more. Next, I drove to the local pharmacy. I waited in line until I reached the counter. Clara, a woman around my age who always worked the holiday shifts, was ringing up my vitamins. Working Christmas again, Clara? I asked. She sighed, bagging the bottles. Always. The extra pay helps, and my kids are grown and out of state anyway. It gets quiet at home. I'm hosting dinner at 1 o'clock on Christmas, I said, handing her my card. If you can take a long lunch break, I have a plate with your name on it. Clara stopped. She looked at me, her eyes softening. Marlene, really? Turkey, potatoes, the works. She nodded slowly. I get a 2-hour break at 1. I'll be there. I left the pharmacy feeling a distinct shift in my chest. The heaviness was gone. I was just getting started. Over the next 3 days, my guest list grew in ways I hadn't anticipated. I didn't post flyers or make a grand announcement. I just paid attention. I invited Mr. Henderson, the retired postman who walked his golden retriever past my house every morning at dawn. I invited a young couple from my book club who were struggling financially and couldn't afford a proper holiday spread. I even invited the barista at the corner coffee shop, who always remembered I liked a dash of cinnamon in my black coffee. By December 20th, I had 18 people confirmed. 18 strangers, acquaintances, and neighbors who had one thing in common. They needed a place to belong on Christmas, and I had the space to give them. My house transformed. I dragged my heavy oak dining table into the living room and attached the extension leaves. I brought in the patio folding table and covered it with a thick, festive tablecloth to make it look seamless. I polished the silver I hadn't used in years. It was exhausting work, but my energy levels were higher than they had been in a decade. I was in the middle of counting soup spoons when a car pulled into my driveway. I peeked through the blinds. It was Arthur and Brenda. I wiped my hands on a cloth and unlocked the front door just as Arthur was reaching for his keys. He looked startled when I pulled the door open before he could insert his key into the lock. "Mom," Arthur said, recovering quickly. "We were just in the neighborhood." Brenda stood slightly behind him, holding a designer handbag, scanning my porch, as if checking for dust. "Hi, Marlene. We actually need a huge favor." I stood in the doorway, blocking their view of the massive dining setup in my living room. "What is it?" Arthur shifted his weight. "We have that pre-Christmas cocktail party tonight and our dog sitter canceled. Can you watch the corgis? It's just for a few hours." I looked at them, taking a slow, steady breath. "No," I answered. The word hung in the cold air between us, crisp and final. Arthur blinked clearly, not expecting that response. "No. But Mom, you always love watching the dogs. And we're in a real bind here." "I'm busy, Arthur. I have my own preparations to finish for the holidays." Brenda stepped forward, her heels clicking on the porch concrete. "Preparations? But you aren't cooking for us anymore. What could you possibly be doing that's so urgent?" "My time is my own." "Brenda," I replied smoothly, ignoring her condescending tone. "I can't help you tonight." Arthur looked frustrated. "Come on, Mom. Are you doing this because you're mad about the restaurant? We said you could still come." "I'm not mad," I stated, and it was the absolute truth. I felt remarkably detached. "But since you're here, there is something I need. Arthur, I need my spare house key back." Both of them froze. "Your key," Arthur echoed. Why did you change the locks or something? No, I'm just reorganizing my security. I'm having contractors in and out for some maintenance next month, and I need all the keys accounted for. Please hand it over. He reached into his pocket, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and irritation. He detached the brass key from his ring and dropped it into my waiting palm. I don't get why you're being so difficult, he muttered. I'm just managing my home. I pocketed the key. Good luck finding a dog sitter. Enjoy your party. I closed the door gently, making sure to engage the deadbolt. Through the window, I watched them walk back to their car. Brenda was gesturing angrily, and Arthur was shaking his head. I walked back to the kitchen. The house was entirely mine now. No financial ties, no unauthorized access. I picked up my favorite mixing bowl and began preparing the stuffing. I had a lot of mouths to feed, and none of them belonged to my son. The days leading up to Christmas were a blur of butter sage and roasted garlic. My kitchen felt alive. I didn't just cook, I orchestrated. I baked 3 different pies, prepared a massive ham alongside the turkey, and made trays of my supposedly old-fashioned scalloped potatoes. Julian came over on Christmas Eve to help me arrange the chairs. He carried heavy boxes of glasses from the basement and helped me set up a small beverage station in the hallway. "This is incredible, Marlene," Julian said, looking at the long, continuous table stretching through my living room. "It looks like a banquet hall." "It looks like a proper Christmas," I corrected him, handing him a mug of hot cider. I realized in that moment how different I felt. In previous years, Christmas Eve was filled with anxiety. I would stress over whether Brenda would find the turkey too dry or if Arthur would complain about the timeline. I used to exhaust myself trying to meet standards that were constantly shifting out of my reach. Now there was only anticipation. I was baking because I wanted to for people who had zero expectations. At 6 o'clock that evening, my phone rang. Arthur's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring. He didn't leave a voicemail. I assumed it was another demand disguised as a request or perhaps a complaint about the locked credit card he had surely discovered by now. It didn't matter. I went to bed early, setting my alarm for 5 in the morning. When I woke up, the house was dark and silent. I tied my apron, turned on the oven, and started the coffee. The smell of roasting turkey began to fill the house by mid-morning. The windows steamed up against the winter cold. I put on a dark green dress, fixed my hair, and waited. At exactly 12:45, the doorbell rang. The first of my 18 guests had arrived, and my new tradition was about to begin. They arrived in waves, bringing an energy into my house that it hadn't seen in years. Julian wore a button-down shirt and brought a bottle of sparkling cider. Clara from the pharmacy arrived right at 1 o'clock, still wearing her name tag, looking relieved to be off her feet. Mr. Henderson brought his golden retriever, who happily settled onto a rug in the corner. The young couple from my book club brought a handmade centerpiece of pine cones and ribbons. By 1:30, all 18 seats were filled. The chatter was loud, warm, and genuine. There was no awkwardness, no subtle criticisms about the decor. People introduced themselves, passed bread baskets, and poured drinks for strangers. I brought out the food, the heavy, old-fashioned food. When I set the massive roasted turkey in the center of the table, the room actually erupted into applause. I felt a flush of pride. Next came the scalloped potatoes bubbling with cheese and heavy cream. Then the green bean casserole, the homemade cranberry sauce, and the rich, dark gravy. "Marlene, this is a masterpiece." Clara sighed, loading her plate. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal like this since my mother passed." "Eat up, Clara," I urged. "There's plenty more in the kitchen." I sat at the head of the table and just watched. Julian was discussing software with a retired mechanic. Mrs. Higgins, the former teacher, was laughing with the barista. They were devouring the food. The potatoes were a massive hit. The gravy boat had to be refilled 3 times. No one asked for a modern aesthetic. No one cared about fusion cuisine. They just wanted warmth, comfort, and a place to belong. I took a bite of my own stuffing. It tasted perfect, better than it had in years. For the first time, I wasn't watching the door waiting for my son to arrive and judge my efforts. I was entirely present. I poured myself a glass of wine and let the joyous noise wash over me. Christmas morning came the next day, bringing a quiet, satisfying peace. The house was a bit messy, but it was a happy kind of mess. Plates were stacked neatly in the sink, the dishwasher was humming, and the fridge was packed with leftovers. I sat at my kitchen island with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the snow fall gently outside my window. The digital clock on the stove read 9:15 a.m. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was Arthur. I picked it up slowly, taking a sip of my coffee before answering. "Hello, Arthur?" "Mom," he breathed. His voice was tight, high-pitched, and laced with absolute panic. "Mom, please tell me you cooked something. Anything." I leaned back in my stool. "Good morning to you, too. What's wrong?" "The restaurant," he practically groaned. "Le Petit Chien, they had a pipe burst in their kitchen last night. The whole place flooded. They canceled all their Christmas reservations this morning via an automated email. We just saw it." I traced the rim of my coffee mug. "That sounds incredibly stressful." "It's a disaster." Arthur's voice cracked. "Brenda's parents are at our house. We have absolutely zero food. Brenda thought we were eating out, so she didn't even buy groceries. The stores are closed, Mom. We have nothing." I didn't smile, but a deep sense of calm settled over me. "I'm sorry to hear that, Arthur. We're coming over," he announced, the panic shifting into his usual assumption of control. "I know you were upset about us changing plans, but I know you always overprepare. You always have a turkey in the freezer or a ham. We can be there in 20 minutes. He waited for me to say yes. He waited for me to step back into my role as the endless provider, the safety net he could mock and then rely on. "Arthur," I said softly, staring out at the snow, "you can't come over here for dinner." There was a sharp silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean I can't come over, Mom? We are starving. Brenda's mom is complaining. Just unlock the door. We'll eat whatever you have in the pantry if we have to." "I don't have anything to feed you, Arthur. There is no backup turkey." "Mom, stop holding a grudge," he snapped. "I know you cook massive amounts of food every year. It's what you do." "It is what I do," I agreed calmly. "Which is why yesterday I hosted 18 people for Christmas dinner. We had turkey, ham, potatoes, and 3 pies. It was wonderful." 18 people, Arthur repeated, utterly bewildered. "Who you don't even talk to 18 people? Neighbors, friends, people who appreciate my old-fashioned cooking." But what about us?" he stammered. "You gave away all the food." "I didn't give it away, Arthur. I served it to my guests. The leftovers are spoken for, and frankly, I am entirely too tired to entertain today. You and Brenda made your plans. You explicitly told me my food wasn't what you wanted. I respected your choice." I heard Brenda's voice shrill in the background, asking what was taking so long. Arthur muttered something to her, then came back to the phone. "Mom, you're punishing us. You knew we'd need you." "I didn't know a restaurant pipe would burst," I stated. "I simply made sure my table was full since you informed me you wouldn't be sitting at it. If you still had your spare key, you might have barged in to find out, but you don't." "My doors are locked, Arthur." "So what are we supposed to do?" he demanded, sounding exactly like he did when he was 7 years old and lost a toy. "You are a grown man," I replied. "I suggest you open your pantry and get creative." "You're really going to let us sit here with nothing on Christmas?" Arthur asked, making one final desperate attempt at guilt. "I am," I answered smoothly. "You wanted a modern aesthetic holiday without my heavy cooking. Now you have one. You'll have to figure out how to feed Brenda's parents. Maybe you can order takeout from a gas station. Mom, I'm going to let you go, Arthur. I have a very quiet, very peaceful day planned. Merry Christmas. I pressed the red button, cutting off whatever protest he was about to launch. I set the phone on the counter and turned it entirely off. I didn't need to hear the follow-up texts or the voicemails from Brenda. Their lack of planning was not my emergency. I walked into the living room. The long table was still there, a physical reminder of what I had built in just a few days. 18 people had left my house yesterday, feeling full, valued, and happy. I hadn't needed to beg for their presence, and I hadn't needed to shrink myself to fit their aesthetic. I didn't need to argue with my son, hire lawyers, or make a grand dramatic exit from his life. I simply stopped being his safety net. I took back my space, my money, and my keys. I went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a generous slice of leftover pecan pie. I poured another cup of coffee, added a splash of heavy cream, and sat by the window. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the street in pristine white. Next year, I decided I would invite 20 people. I took a bite of the pie. It was rich, sweet, and perfectly old-fashioned, just the way I liked it.